I think I grew up in a family that had a considerable amount of promise in the sense that I think my parents intended to really love each other and to raise children the way that their parents had. But there was a brokenness that was involved in my parents as well that kind of infiltrated into all of us as children. I had a brother and two sisters, and all of us ended up scarred. My father, as it turns out, just seemed incapable of loving my mother, and my mother seemed pretty capable of loving quite a few other people, and so we were destined for a bad situation. So my parents divorced when I was 7. I was already feeling a great distance from my father, and a feeling that he greatly valued my older brother, who was interested in so many things that I was not. From a very early age, I was introspective, enjoyed writing and those kinds of things, and they were squirrel hunters and cat fishermen and that kind of thing. But I know that my dad loved me regardless, and so at least I was able to hang on to that. But when I was 7 years old, on a morning in a little town in Bridgeport where my dad had promised to take me out to, of all things, frog gig in the morning on a pond, I woke up and was told that he had gone. And he never returned, and I was 7 years old. Actually, I woke up in time, ran down to eat breakfast, and actually was able to stand on the front porch and watch the car drive away. And my mother first said, your dad's just mad, he'll be back. And then shortly after that, she said, your dad's not coming back. And I remember thinking that he had somehow made a choice. First, I thought, well, he chose my older brother because my older brother actually went with him and left that morning and then returned later. And so in my mind, I thought I was given this last opportunity to measure up, and I hadn't in some way measured up. He wrote me a few years later, and occasionally. He was a writer, and I think he was my inspiration in a sense because I thought this is the only thing that I have in common with my dad. And even if I was never, ever going to know him, I was driven to do something that I thought might make him proud of me and maybe even might make him come back, which of course he never did. My dad died years later. He was an alcoholic. He never overcame his addiction, and he actually froze to death alone on the streets of Fort Worth, and we found him after his death. I reconciled with my dad years later, even after his death, by going to his cemetery and doing something that was greatly symbolic to me. I took a 1962 penny, the year that he left, and I went and I sat at his grave and I spoke to him for a while, and then I took the penny and I just drove it down into the ground on his grave and walked away. And to me, that was the only way that I could actually forgive him, but I needed to remember that I had, because I knew that sometimes forgiveness is hard to remember that we've done it, and it creeps back in on us. Shortly after my dad left, my brother was in Boy Scouts, and my mother thought it would be a good idea if I went with him. I was too young. I was only 8 years old, but the scoutmaster was perfectly happy to have me join, and in fact said that he would take extra care to make sure that none of the boys gave me any problems. And of course that meant spending time in his tent and always riding with him to events. I remember the very first night we were in a large room at the city park watching a movie, and I began to realize that he was pulling me in, and how great that felt. How that felt like what I thought my dad should be doing. You know, it made me think I'm in a recliner and I'm climbing up into my father's lap. And so, not that I was I was more of an ignorant participant, but it made me feel good. It made me happy. Things progressed fairly rapidly into a very violent situation on a camp out. And I've always said, that is one of the worst things that happened to me in my entire life. But actually, what happened afterwards was worse, and I think is so damaging to boys and girls. When we went back home, I told my brother, and my brother, who loved his scoutmaster and was embarrassed by his little brother, just hauled off and hit me as hard as he could, a pain that I've never forgotten, and said, "Don't you ever say that again." I told my mother, and she said, "It's not nice to make things up about people." And so I went into a period of silence from that point. I grew up extremely independent and extremely withdrawn from people. I did not like to be touched. I remember when I was 18, somebody insisted that I was going to have to learn how to shake hands. I was so averse to actually touching people, especially men. I don't look back, with everything that I've read and everything that people have told me, I don't look back and say I ended up with a problem with homosexuality and same-sex attraction because I was sexually abused as a child and father abandoned. But I do believe that anybody who is in those kinds of situations where your father leaves or your mother leaves or you're sexually abused, it is going to impact you in some way. It's going to open up something in your life, and it is going to have an impact that's going to lead you in a direction you would never have gone. This happened to be the direction that I went. And I know there are people who say, I never was abused, and I still developed same-sex attraction, and I understand that. But I do believe that this had definite impact on the direction I was going in, because I know what it caused me to seek. And it caused me to seek male affirmation and male comfort wherever I could find it. When I went to college and I met my roommate, as difficult as it is even for me now to say, knowing everything that I know about same-sex attractions, I felt like I had met the person that I really was going to fall in love with. It was a situation, you see, it's kind of like his thought and my thought would merge, and he would complete my sentences, and he knew what I wanted, and if he was going somewhere, he brought stuff back, and we became so close that is the first time I felt like somebody was, in a sense, completing me, and I definitely wanted to please him, because the worst thing in the world to me at that point, after having lost my father, having lost the love of the scoutmaster who moved on to someone older, someone younger, because I had gotten older, and then also my brother and I never developing a relationship, I finally had one, and I was going to do everything I could to keep it. He was homosexually inclined. We took advantage of that in each other, and we just about killed each other because we both, as Christians, blamed each other for what each of us was doing wrong. In other words, he wouldn't be doing it if I wasn't there. I wouldn't be doing it if he wasn't there. So we were both kind of walking each other on a pathway straight into hell was the way we remember it. And so eventually we just kind of made life hell for each other. I developed the double life at that point because I was still having trouble with sexuality. I was attracted to men. It was stronger when I came home. I was extremely jealous that my roommate was now with someone else. And I found myself trending more into the same-sex attraction world, but realizing that everybody important to me, from family to friends to the respect of the people on the campus to potential employers, I saw all of them over here. And I thought, these two worlds can never meet. And I crafted what I think probably is one of the most effective double lives that you will ever see, to the detriment of myself and a whole lot of other people. And it came from my concern that there was absolutely no one, I reasoned it out, that I could talk to that would understand this issue other than people who had the issue. And I didn't know anyone who had the issue that didn't want to have it. This was a long time ago. We didn't have organizations of people who said, I want to be free. If you wanted to be free, you were just completely quiet and struggled on your own. If you didn't want to be free, you went to the other side. About 2 years later, I married Lisa. My wife probably is the most open, honest, and real person I have ever met in my entire life. And something in me said, I cannot live without her. She's the only real thing that I know. I have lived a life of deception among deceptive people, and she's real. I called her on the phone and asked her to marry me, and her parents went into shock, and she said yes, and that was in May, and in July we got married. I told her that I had attraction towards men, but I was deceptive. Deception has been my greatest sin, and one of my greatest assets for getting away with things was deception. I wasn't clear. In other words, I knew I took advantage of Lisa's innocence, and I knew that she loved hearing me tell her what she thought was the truth. And in fact, probably it strengthened her commitment to me because she felt like she was hearing. She didn't marry me as a missionary. That's not Lisa. She married me because she loved me. But I think she married me out of a naivety that said this won't really be a problem because like sometimes men marry thinking, okay, if I get married, this won't be a problem. I think she married in the sense of if he gets married, this won't be a problem. So she was more naive than I was. I was not at the time active sexually with men. And so there was a part of me that said, well, maybe that's over. But it was always a maybe, it was not a thank God that's over. It was a maybe that's over. And it wasn't. And I was so ashamed. I mean, we got married, and for the first year or two, it was a lot of energy put into avoidance. It was easier to avoid back then because you didn't have the internet and all of these kinds of things. And so you could just make sure you were always with your wife or always, we had 5 children just about like that, 5 children in 8 years. And so, just got swallowed up in the family life. And my career began to take off. I was becoming known as a writer and doing pretty well in the newspaper business and becoming a publisher and an editor before I joined AT&T as a speechwriter. But again, what I found myself doing was falling back on the old, putting all of the energy of my life into this life over here, paying no attention to this one that was beginning to creep back in. When I would feel depressed or stressed over the children, I would go back into that mode of just wanting somebody to like me, just seeking some kind of comfort from a man. I was so angry at my father still at that period of life. I was not saying to myself, I want a father. I wasn't going out and looking for some older male to mentor me or comfort me or satisfy me in some way. I just wanted what I would hear people describe as a buddy. I never had very many friends. I was so independent. I wanted a buddy. But I didn't really know how to do that. And I began to take advantage of things that I would hear, like a potential to do something in a library or a rest stop. And in my mind, I would think, okay, these are totally away from everybody. Nobody will ever know. It won't hurt anybody. As long as I keep it to myself, keep it quiet, it'll never hurt anybody. And so once you begin to allow a little bit of that to creep in, it becomes habitual. Because it does temporarily do what you think it's going to do. There is some satisfaction involved, that you do come away with this brief feeling that this person really actually cares about me, or why would they do this with me? They really like me. They chose me. They could have chosen someone else, and so it begins to creep in. It comes from comfort to just pure habit and dependency, just like any other addiction. You can go so long, and then you find yourself actually creating scenarios that will allow you to justify it. There was never a time I can remember not feeling guilty. And the reason that I felt guilty was because I knew that this was not what God intended. I had read enough, I had heard enough, and I could compare my life to other people's lives. And so I knew this is not what God intended. But basically what I was experiencing at this point of time, because again, my desire to live my life with no complications, including, in a sense, God wanting to make changes in me, I would feel the guilt, but I would not seek the repentance. I would seek some way to make the guilt go away. And that's when I began to, for instance, when I went to the Baptist Student Union in the early days, I had to be the president, and I had to be the one that went to Bangladesh. And when I got my first job, I had to win the awards in the newspapers. When I got my job at AT&T, I had to excel and go into upper-level management. When I went to a church, and we were very active in church, I had to be a deacon, and later I had to be an elder, and I had to be revered. When I had children, I had to write books about children because I wanted everybody to know what a wonderful dad I was. And so my first books were all about my children, and people just thought, I was front page newspaper story, just wonderful, wonderful father of the year. I found myself willing to put at risk everything everything. My reputation, my family, my faith, harm to the church, harm to the Word of God, to be able to say one thing and do another. And yet the addiction was so strong in my life that I would find myself still doing that. I do think that it was in part the adrenaline of taking a risk. When I look back, I think, no, that was not it. It was just, I would say to myself, well, the only opportunities are risky opportunities. In other words, how else are you going to meet somebody? You can't just walk up to somebody at church and say, hey, so you do put yourself in these risky positions. And it was devastating to me because actually I did get caught in a risky position. And all of those things that I just said about that I put everything out there at risk to lose, I did lose all of it. I began to hear about this particular park in Oklahoma City that you could park in and people would come up and visit with you. And the thrill, sometimes for me, the communication was almost as important or almost as fulfilling as actually doing something with someone back in those days. Talking about it and hearing them seem interested and attracted to me seemed almost as important. So I went to this park. I was sitting there. I was having lunch. A car drove up. A nice young guy in the car, and he started visiting with me, and we had this conversation about, this park's a little shady, those kinds of things, and really not very much was said. And he said, well, yeah, it is kind of dangerous over here, so, if you really want to, have a more intimate conversation, was the way he put it, we should go over to this other part of the park. And so he said, so just follow me. And so I followed him in my car over to the other park, and I backed into this parking spot. Now, in my mind, I've gone far enough into the cycle to where probably I'm going to go through with something, stupid as it was, middle of the day. And so we're parked over there, and as soon as I drove my car in and backed it in, then 3 other cars came and pulled in front of mine. And the police officers jumped out of their cars, and they said, told me to get out of the car, and they said, you're being placed under arrest for offering to engage in a lewd act. And that was it. Because once you've been on the front page of the Daily Oklahoman, arrested as a chief of staff and an author of children's books makes you a front page material. And you go through a public trial and consequently found not guilty, which actually I feel guilty about being found not guilty because when I look back, I say, uninterrupted, I would have been guilty, but once you've gone through something like that, then everything else is gone. That is how you're known from that point on. That is who you are. Based on the non-guilty verdict, I was allowed to keep my position at AT&T and in fact continue to be promoted upwards. I went through church discipline experience at the church and continued to work within the church. My family stayed together, and I thought I had greatly rescued myself, is the way that I put it. I thanked God for that, but I still was not close enough to God to be able to turn my life around. And as stress and everything continued to go in, I found myself now with the internet starting to communicate with people through things like Craigslist and personal ads and those kinds of things. And I'd say 95% of the time, that's all it was just communicating. But my youngest daughter, I have 4 sons and a daughter. My youngest daughter found the emails. And so she knew that this communication was still going on. She kept that secret buried for probably 3 years because she didn't know what to do with it. She was only about 12 years old and she didn't know what to do with it. She finally told her older brother, my oldest son. They decided to go back to the church with it. And at that point, the church exercised church discipline to the point of removing me from the church. I was an elder and had betrayed everyone. And as I said, the deception is my greatest sin. After I left the church and and went through a period of time basically churchless before we found another church that we could explain everything to and go back into. And I was going through men's ministry that's designed to help men who suffer with various sexual brokenness issues, pornography and masturbation, in addition to, and idolatry and adultery, adulterous affairs in addition to homosexuality, that I began to actually understand grace and understand forgiveness and all of those things that, while I had accepted God at sort of a face value level, I had never accepted the fact that he valued me enough to actually forgive me and give me grace. What I kept expecting from God was strength. You know, I have this problem, God, and I need strength. I have this problem, God, and I need strength. I don't want to do this again, so I need strength. You know, and that was my concept of what a God should give you, is strength. You have something that's too powerful for you, but you have a powerful God, so give it to God and get the strength and get through it. And I began to understand grace, kind of in the sense of, I had broken every light bulb in the house, and you look out and the moon is full, and you realize there is still light. No matter all of these things that I have done, there is still light. And so I realized at that point, I had built the double life, not to deceive God. I had known all along that I was in no way deceiving God. And in a sense, there was a part of me that said, eventually, this is going to come out, you know, just because of God. No matter how much I fool all of these other people, eventually it's going to come out because of God. But I had built this double life to fool my wife, fool my children, fool my employers, fool my church, always with a sense of, I won't have to do this very long. I'll find the answer over here. You know, it wasn't like, I'm doing this so I can be this way forever. It was, it won't be very long. But then years pass and children grow and children get married, and all of a sudden you realize you're still fighting the same problem. And it was a mentor in the ministry who said to me, he said, you know, I have to admit, I think you are probably, in all my years of ministry, which is 20 some odd, the most hardcore problem that I've ever seen. He said, part of it is because you think too hard, and you think that you can reason all of this out and make it work. And the second part of the reason is you care about what other people think about you, even though you're doing all kinds of things that you know other people would not like to know about you. So it makes you put all of your energy into making sure you balance the scales with things that they like. And until you decide that the only thing that matters is what Jesus Christ thinks about you, you will never find freedom. I needed to stop thinking about what anybody else thought about me and think clearly and distinctly about what Christ thought about me. It is the first time, because of all the denial, that I actually went back to the Bible and said, I'm going to read it. I'm going to find out what the Bible says. It was only when I was able to develop a personal, trusting, faith-based relationship with Christ and believe that there is in no way, at any time, under any circumstance, that he ever turns away. Even if your whole life has been built around people who turned away, when you realize nothing, no circumstance, will he ever turn away. And that is an intimacy that I had never had with anyone, and a trust level that I never thought I was capable of.